The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the Sistine Chapel, painting colorful patterns across the marble floor. It was just after dawn, and Pope Leo XIII walked alone through the quiet corridors of the Vatican. At 72 years old, he still rose before most of the Vatican staff, treasuring these peaceful moments before the day's duties began. He paused by one of the tall windows, gazing out at the St. Peter's Square below. A few early visitors were already gathering, their faces turned upward in wonder at the magnificent basilica. The Pope smiled gently. Even after 5 years as the head of the Catholic Church, he never took this view for granted. "Your Holiness," a soft voice called from behind him. Pope Leo turned to find Sister Francesca, one of his most trusted advisors, approaching with a folder tucked under her arm. "Good morning, Sister," he greeted her warmly. "You're up early today." "As are you, Holy Father," she replied with a knowing smile. They both knew his habit of early morning wanderings. "The choir director asked me to give you the program for Sunday's rehearsal. He's very excited about the new arrangements." The Pope took the folder and flipped through the pages, his eyes brightening as he read the selection of hymns. Music had always been his passion, long before he'd taken his vows as a young man in a small parish in northern Italy. Back then, he had been simply Giovanni Russo, the baker's son who sang in the church choir and dreamed of becoming a composer. Life had led him down a different path, but his love for sacred music had never diminished. In fact, since becoming Pope, he had made the revival of the Sistine Chapel choir one of his personal missions. "Beautiful selections," he murmured, running his finger along the list. "Ave Maria," Panis Angelicus, and the Mozart Requiem. Ambitious for a single rehearsal, isn't it? Sister Francesca nodded. The choir has been practicing separately. This will be their first full rehearsal together, and... She hesitated briefly. "The pianist arrives today." "Ah, yes. Alessandro Bianchi." The Pope's expression grew thoughtful. "I've heard recordings of his performances. Brilliant technique, though perhaps a bit forceful for sacred music," the Cardinal Secretary suggested him. "He's quite famous, and his participation will certainly bring attention to the charity concert." Pope Leo nodded slowly. The upcoming concert would raise funds for children's hospitals across Italy, a cause close to his heart. If a renowned pianist could help fill seats and open wallets, perhaps his strong personality was worth accommodating. "Well, we shall welcome him with open arms," the Pope said, closing the folder. "Now I believe it's time for morning prayers." By midday, word had spread throughout the Vatican that Alessandro Bianchi had arrived, and not quietly. The pianist had apparently argued with security about the screening of his personal items, complained about the accommodations prepared for him, and dismissed an assistant who had offered to show him to the rehearsal space. He insists he needs 2 hours alone with the piano before anyone else enters the chapel, Cardinal Rossi reported to the Pope during their lunch meeting. The Cardinal, a small man with perpetually furrowed brows, seemed particularly bothered by the pianist's demands. "Holy Father, perhaps we should reconsider this arrangement. There are other pianists who would be honored to perform without making such impositions." Pope Leo took a sip of his soup before responding. "Sometimes the most beautiful instruments produce the loudest noise when out of tune," he said with a small smile. "Let us give Maestro Bianchi his time with the piano. Perhaps that's all he needs to feel comfortable." Cardinal Rossi looked unconvinced but nodded respectfully. "As you wish, Your Holiness." After lunch, Pope Leo retreated to his private study, where he spent several hours reviewing documents and taking meetings with various officials. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened across his desk, his mind kept drifting to the choir rehearsal scheduled for that evening. Finally, he set aside the document he'd been trying to read for the past 20 minutes and rose from his chair. "I think I'll take a walk," he told his secretary, who knew better than to offer to accompany him. These solitary walks were precious to the Pope, rare moments when he could be almost alone with his thoughts. His feet carried him, almost of their own accord, toward the Sistine Chapel. As he approached, he could hear the sound of the piano, faint at first, then growing stronger as he drew nearer. He paused outside the massive doors, listening. The music that flowed from within was undeniably beautiful. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, played with technical perfection. Every note was precisely where it should be. Every dynamic shift executed flawlessly, yet something seemed missing. The Pope couldn't quite name it, but he felt a certain coldness in the performance, as if the pianist were demonstrating his skill rather than expressing his soul. He waited until the piece concluded before quietly opening one of the side doors and slipping inside. The chapel was empty except for a man seated at the grand piano on the temporary platform that had been set up for the concert. The man's back was to the door, his posture rigid even in the moment of silence following the music. Pope Leo moved silently to one of the back benches and sat down, content simply to observe. The pianist began another piece, this time Bach's Prelude in C major. Again, the performance was technically flawless, yet strangely mechanical. When the piece ended, the Pope couldn't help himself. He applauded softly, the sound echoing in the vast space of the chapel. The pianist spun around on the bench, his face registering shock and then recognition. He stood quickly and gave a stiff bow. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice carrying across the chapel. "I wasn't aware I had an audience." "Please don't stop on my account," Pope Leo said, rising and walking slowly down the center aisle. "You play beautifully, Maestro Bianchi. I've enjoyed listening." Up close, Alessandro Bianchi was younger than the Pope had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with sharp features and intense dark eyes. His black hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place, and his tailored suit seemed almost too formal for a rehearsal. "You know who I am," Alessandro said, more statement than question. "Of course. Your reputation precedes you." The Pope smiled warmly. "I've listened to your recording of Liszt's Transcendental Etudes many times. Your technique is remarkable." Something flickered in the pianist's eyes. Pride, certainly, but perhaps also surprise at being recognized by the Pope. "Thank you, Your Holiness," he said, his tone softening slightly. "I didn't expect the head of the Catholic Church to be familiar with my work. Before I was Pope, I was simply a man who loved music," Leo replied, reaching the platform now and gazing thoughtfully at the piano. "I still am beneath these robes." Alessandro seemed unsure how to respond to this moment of humanity from the pontiff. He gestured awkwardly to the piano. Would you like to hear something specific?" "What will you be playing with our choir tonight?" "Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus and Bach's Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring, among others," Alessandro replied, his professional demeanor returning. "Though I've suggested some modifications to the arrangements. The traditional versions are a bit simplistic for a concert of this caliber." Pope Leo raised an eyebrow but kept his voice gentle. "Those pieces have moved the faithful for centuries in their original form, and they will continue to do so," Alessandro said dismissively. "But for this concert, we need something more impressive. People expect a show, even in a church." Before the Pope could respond, the doors of the chapel opened again, and members of the Sistine Chapel choir began to enter. They moved quietly, respectfully, many stopping to bow or kneel briefly when they noticed the Pope's presence. "It seems our conversation must continue another time," Pope Leo said, stepping back from the platform. "I look forward to hearing your rehearsal, Maestro Bianchi." "You're staying?" Alessandro asked, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I never miss a Sunday rehearsal," the Pope replied with a smile. "It's a personal tradition of mine." He made his way back to the rear bench as the 40 members of the choir took their places on the risers behind the piano. The choir director, a gentle-mannered man named Roberto who had served the Vatican for over 20 years, approached the Pope and bowed deeply. "Your Holiness, we are honored by your presence, as always," Roberto said. "The honor is mine," Pope Leo replied sincerely. "I see you've met our guest pianist?" Roberto's expression remained professional, but the Pope didn't miss the slight tightening around his eyes. "Yes, Maestro Bianchi and I have discussed the program. It promises to be an interesting rehearsal." With that understatement hanging in the air, Roberto returned to the front of the chapel and called the choir to attention. The Pope settled back on his bench, folded his hands in his lap, and prepared to listen. Little did he know that this evening's music would lead to one of the most challenging and ultimately profound moments of his papacy. The rehearsal began with a tension that everyone in the Sistine Chapel could feel. Alessandro Bianchi sat at the piano, his back straight as a board, fingers poised above the keys with practiced precision. The choir members exchanged nervous glances as their director Roberto cleared his throat. "Let's begin with Ave Verum Corpus," Roberto suggested, his voice gentle but firm. "As we've practiced, please." Alessandro nodded curtly and began to play the opening notes. Immediately, Pope Leo XIV noticed the difference. The tempo was nearly twice as fast as the piece was traditionally performed, the delicate phrases rushing by like leaves in a storm wind. Before the choir could even join in, Alessandro stopped abruptly, his hands lifting from the keys. "Is there a problem?" Roberto asked. "Your choir is hesitating," Alessandro replied without turning around. "They need to keep up with my tempo." From the back of the chapel, Pope Leo watched as Roberto's face flushed slightly. The choir director was a patient man, but even he seemed taken aback by the pianist's bluntness. "Maestro Bianchi," Roberto said carefully, "this piece is traditionally performed at a more contemplative pace. The text speaks of Christ's suffering. It calls for reverence." Alessandro's shoulders stiffened visibly. "Traditional doesn't mean correct," he said. "Mozart would have appreciated innovation. Music shouldn't be trapped in the past simply because of religious sentiment." A murmur ran through the choir. Such words, spoken in the Sistine Chapel, were shocking to many of them. Roberto glanced back at Pope Leo, clearly unsure how to proceed. The Pope gave him a small nod of encouragement. He had no intention of interfering with the rehearsal, but he was curious to see how this clash of artistic visions would resolve itself. "Perhaps," Roberto suggested, "we could try it once your way and once the traditional way. Then we can decide which better serves the purpose of our concert." It was a diplomatic solution, but Alessandro didn't seem impressed. "Fine," he said shortly, "but I should warn you that I've already rewritten some of the arrangements to better showcase both the piano and the acoustics of this space." He pulled out a stack of sheet music from his bag and handed it to Roberto. The choir director leafed through the pages, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "These are significant changes, Maestro Bianchi," Roberto said. "Our choir has been practicing the traditional arrangements for weeks." "Then they'll need to adapt," Alessandro replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. "True musicians should be able to read new music on sight." Pope Leo leaned forward slightly on his bench. Though he remained silent, he found himself troubled by the pianist's approach. Music in the church had never been about showcasing individual talent. It was about creating a collective expression of faith. Alessandro seemed to have missed this fundamental point. Roberto, to his credit, remained professional. "Let's try the original arrangement first so I can hear how your changes compare," he suggested. "Choir, from the beginning, please." The singers straightened their postures and lifted their music folders. Roberto raised his hands to conduct, and Alessandro began to play again. This time he kept to a more traditional tempo, though the Pope could sense his impatience in the sharp way his fingers struck the keys. When the choir joined in, their voices rising in perfect harmony, something remarkable happened. Even Alessandro seemed affected by the beauty of the moment. His playing softened slightly, his rigid posture relaxing as the ancient words of the hymn filled the chapel. For a brief time there was perfect unity between pianist, choir, and the sacred space around them. When the piece ended, a reverent silence filled the chapel. Pope Leo closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the lingering echoes of the music. Alessandro was the first to break the spell. "It's nice," he said, turning to face the choir for the first time. "But too safe. Anyone could perform it this way. If we want to make an impact, we need to do something different." He turned back to the piano and began to play his revised version without waiting for Roberto's signal. The tempo was indeed faster. The harmonies altered in subtle but significant ways. It was undeniably impressive from a technical standpoint. But Pope Leo felt that something essential had been lost in the transformation. The choir tried to follow along, but many stumbled over the unexpected changes. Alessandro stopped playing after only a few measures, his frustration evident. "You're not following the new dynamics," he said sharply. "The crescendo needs to happen earlier, and the sopranos are coming in too softly." One of the older choir members, a woman who had sung in the Sistine Chapel choir for over 30 years, spoke up hesitantly. "Forgive me, Maestro, but we've always sung it the other way. It would take time to learn these new arrangements properly." Alessandro turned to her with cold eyes. "Then perhaps it's time for new blood in this choir. Music doesn't progress when performers are stuck in their ways." The woman's face fell, and several other choir members looked offended. Roberto stepped forward quickly, trying to salvage the situation. "We have limited rehearsal time before the concert," he reminded Alessandro. "Perhaps we should focus on perfecting the traditional arrangements that the choir already knows well." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps church music in the Dark Ages," Alessandro retorted. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. seeming genuinely baffled by the resistance to his ideas. "Don't you want this concert to be remembered? To stand out from the hundreds of other church concerts that happen every year?" Pope Leo decided it was time to offer some gentle guidance. He rose from his bench and walked slowly down the center aisle again. The choir members noticed him approaching and fell silent, many bowing their heads respectfully as he passed. "If I might make a suggestion," the Pope said, his voice warm and thoughtful, "sacred music serves a purpose beyond entertainment or artistic innovation. It's meant to lift the soul toward heaven, to help us glimpse something of the divine." Alessandro turned on the piano bench to face him, his expression careful, but still holding a hint of defiance. "With all due respect, Your Holiness, I was invited here because of my artistic vision. Every great composer in history pushed boundaries. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, they were all innovators in their time." "Indeed they were," Pope Leo agreed, coming to stand near the piano. "And yet their innovations were in service to something greater than themselves. They sought to express the inexpressible, to give voice to the deepest yearnings of the human spirit." The Pope ran his fingers lightly over the edge of the piano, a gesture that revealed his own familiarity with the instrument. "Maestro Bianchi, your technical skill is extraordinary. No one here would question that. But perhaps in this setting, that skill might best be used to enhance the sacred character of the music rather than to transform it." Alessandro's jaw tightened. It was clear he wasn't accustomed to having his artistic choices questioned, even by the Pope himself. "I was under the impression," he said stiffly, "that I was hired to elevate this concert above the ordinary. If you wanted a simple traditional performance, perhaps you should have hired a church organist instead of a concert pianist." Several gasps came from the choir. Even Roberto looked shocked at the pianist's tone. Pope Leo, however, remained serene. "There's profound beauty in tradition," he said gently. "The melodies we're singing today have moved hearts for centuries. That doesn't make them simple. It proves their power." Alessandro stood up suddenly from the piano bench, gathering his modified sheet music with quick, jerky movements. "It seems my artistic vision isn't welcome here. Perhaps this collaboration was a mistake." Pope Leo regarded him thoughtfully. He could see beyond the younger man's arrogance to something else, a deep insecurity perhaps, or a desperate need to prove himself. "No mistake," the Pope said. "Just an opportunity for growth for all of us." He gestured to the piano. "Please continue the rehearsal. I believe Gesù, Joy of Man's Desiring, was next on the program." For a moment it seemed Alessandro might actually walk out. His body was tense, poised for departure. Then, with visible effort, he sat back down at the piano. "As you wish," he said, though his tone made it clear he was far from convinced. "But I still maintain that my arrangements would make for a more memorable concert. Why don't we try one of your arrangements for this piece?" Pope Leo suggested, surprising everyone in the chapel, including Alessandro himself. Sometimes the new and the traditional can find harmony together. The pianist looked up, clearly caught off guard by this concession. "You're willing to hear it?" "Of course," the Pope said with a gentle smile. "I may be old, but my ears are still open to beauty in all its forms." This small olive branch seemed to soften something in Alessandro. He nodded and positioned his hands over the keys once more. "From the beginning, then," he said, his voice slightly less rigid than before. As the familiar notes of Bach's beloved piece began to fill the chapel, Pope Leo returned to his seat, hopeful that perhaps the evening might yet end in harmony. Little did he know that the real challenge to his patience and wisdom was still to come. The rehearsal continued with a fragile piece. Alessandro played Bach's Gesù, Joy of Man's Desiring with his own interpretations, some of which were actually quite beautiful. The choir followed as best they could, stumbling occasionally over the unexpected flourishes and tempo changes. Pope Leo watched from his bench, nodding encouragement whenever the choir looked his way. As they moved through the program, the atmosphere in the Sistine Chapel gradually relaxed. Even Roberto seemed less tense, his conducting more fluid as he adapted to Alessandro's style. For a brief while it appeared that the two artistic visions, traditional and innovative, might find a way to coexist. Then they reached Mozart's Requiem. "We'll be performing just the Lacrimosa section for the concert," Roberto explained to Alessandro. "It's a favorite among our regular attendees." The pianist flipped through his sheet music with a frown. "The Requiem is Mozart's masterpiece," he said. Performing just one section is like reading a single chapter from a great novel. Time constraints, Roberto explained patiently. The full requiem would take nearly an hour. Alessandro shrugged. Then cut something else. This piece deserves to be heard in its entirety or not at all. Pope Leo leaned forward slightly. The Mozart Requiem held special significance for him. He had first heard it as a young seminarian, and the music had touched something deep in his soul, confirming his calling to the priesthood. The Lacrimosa in particular, that mournful, yearning melody, had brought tears to his eyes then, and still did whenever he heard it. Perhaps, the Pope suggested gently, we could include more sections in the future, but for this concert, the Lacrimosa alone would be most appropriate. Alessandro turned on the bench to look directly at Pope Leo. There was something challenging in his gaze, as if he were tired of tempering his opinions in the presence of the pontiff. Your Holiness, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel. With all respect, this is precisely the problem with religious music today. Always compromising, always simplifying, always catering to the lowest common denominator of musical taste. The choir members exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had found Alessandro difficult couldn't believe he was speaking this way to the Pope himself. We're not suggesting simplifying the piece, Roberto interjected quickly, merely selecting one complete movement due to time considerations. Alessandro wasn't listening. He had launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech, his frustration finally boiling over. The Church once led the world in musical innovation, he continued, his hands gesturing emphatically. Gregorian chant, polyphony, these were revolutionary in their time. Now sacred music is stuck in the past, afraid to evolve while the rest of the musical world moves forward. We play the same pieces the same way year after year, and wonder why young people find church music boring. Pope Leo listened calmly, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. When Alessandro paused for breath, the Pope spoke quietly. There is wisdom in what you say, Maestro Bianchi. The Church should never fear artistic growth, but neither should we chase novelty for its own sake. Sacred music serves a purpose beyond entertainment or artistic expression. It is a form of prayer, a way to touch the divine. But it could be so much more, Alessandro insisted, warming to his topic. The acoustics in this chapel are extraordinary. The talent in this choir is undeniable. With the right arrangements, the right vision, we could create something truly transcendent, something that would bring people to tears, something they would remember forever. And is that the purpose of sacred music? Pope Leo asked gently. To be remembered? Or to help us remember what truly matters? Alessandro's expression hardened. He seemed to take the Pope's philosophical question as a dismissal of his artistic vision. With respect, Your Holiness, he said, his voice now taking on a decidedly cold tone. You're not a musician. You can appreciate music, certainly. But understanding how to create it, how to shape it to move an audience, that requires years of specialized training and talent. A collective intake of breath echoed through the chapel. Several of the cardinals who had been observing the rehearsal from the side of the room stepped forward, their faces darkening with anger at this direct challenge to the Pope's authority. Maestro Bianchi, one of them said sternly, you forget yourself. Alessandro stood up from the piano bench, his face flushed with emotion. No, I remember exactly who I am. I am Alessandro Bianchi. I performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. I've studied under the finest teachers in Europe. I've dedicated my life to musical excellence. And I was brought here because of that excellence. He turned back to Pope Leo, who remained perfectly still on his bench, watching the scene unfold with calm eyes. With all due respect, Holy Father, Alessandro continued, his voice now rising, music is my domain. Perhaps you should stick to prayers and leave the artistry to professionals. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The chapel fell into absolute silence. Some choir members gasped audibly while others lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Roberto stood frozen, his conductor's baton hanging limply at his side. The cardinals began moving forward as one, their expressions grim. Alessandro, suddenly aware of what he had done, remained standing by the piano. His face showed no regret, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features as he realized the depth of the silence surrounding him. Pope Leo XIV sat very still. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes never leaving Alessandro's face. When he finally rose from his bench, he did so slowly, deliberately, with the dignity of his office evident in every movement. The cardinals reached Alessandro first. "This is unacceptable," one of them said in a low, angry voice. "You will apologize to His Holiness immediately and then leave the Vatican." "Your services are no longer required," another added coldly. "We will find another pianist for the concert." Alessandro stood rigid, trapped between pride and the sudden realization of the consequences of his outburst. He looked past the cardinals to Pope Leo, who was now walking slowly down the center aisle toward the piano. The tension in the chapel was unbearable. Several choir members were near tears. Roberto had stepped back, clearly assuming the rehearsal was over. Even the usually unflappable Sister Francesca, who had slipped in during the rehearsal and was standing by the door, looked shocked. As Pope Leo approached, the cardinals parted to let him through, their faces expectant. Everyone in the chapel assumed the Pope would deliver a rebuke, perhaps even call for Alessandro to be escorted from the Vatican immediately. What happened next would be retold countless times in the years to come. Pope Leo stopped a few feet from Alessandro and simply looked at him, not with anger or offense, but with genuine curiosity, as if seeing something in the younger man that others had missed. "You feel very strongly about music," the Pope said quietly. Alessandro, prepared for condemnation, seemed thrown off balance by this simple observation. Yes, it's my life." Pope Leo nodded thoughtfully. "That passion is a gift, you know. A gift from God." The pianist shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unexpected turn in the conversation. "Your Holiness," one of the cardinals began, "this man has shown inexcusable disrespect. He should be—" Pope Leo raised his hand gently, and the cardinal fell silent immediately. "Maestro Bianchi," the Pope said, still speaking directly to Alessandro, "I wonder if you would play the Lacrimosa for us now, just as you believe it should be played, not as a compromise, but as your true artistic vision." The request was so unexpected that Alessandro could only stare for a moment. Then slowly he nodded and sat back down at the piano bench. The chapel remained utterly still as Alessandro positioned his hands over the keys. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes briefly, and then began to play. The music that filled the Sistine Chapel in that moment was unlike anything the choir had ever heard. Alessandro played with extraordinary emotion, his earlier rigidity transformed into a kind of controlled passion that brought out nuances in Mozart's composition that many present had never noticed before. The familiar notes of the Lacrimosa seemed new somehow, both faithful to the original and yet imbued with a fresh perspective. Without being directed, the choir began to sing, following Alessandro's lead as if drawn by the music itself. Their voices blended with the piano in perfect harmony, rising to fill every corner of the ancient chapel. When the final notes faded away, Pope Leo was standing with his eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. He opened his eyes to find Alessandro watching him, the pianist's expression a complex mixture of pride, defiance, and something else, perhaps the first flicker of respect. That, the Pope said quietly, was a prayer. Alessandro looked down at the keys, seemingly at a loss for words for the first time since his arrival. The momentary peace, however, would prove short-lived. The wounds of public humiliation were not so easily healed, and the true test of both men's character still lay ahead. The silence that followed Pope Leo's quiet words felt almost sacred. For a brief moment, the tension in the Sistine Chapel had transformed into something else, a shared recognition of the power of music to transcend personal differences. But that moment quickly passed. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Rossi said firmly, stepping forward, "while we all appreciate Maestro Bianchi's musical talent, his behavior has been inexcusable. Perhaps it would be best if we concluded this rehearsal and found a more suitable musician for our concert." Several other cardinals nodded in agreement, their faces stern. Alessandro remained seated at the piano, his expression unreadable. The choir members watched anxiously, most of them expecting the pianist to be dismissed on the spot. Pope Leo looked thoughtfully at Cardinal Rossi, then at the other church officials who clearly awaited his decision. He understood their position. In their eyes, Alessandro had committed an unforgivable breach of protocol. The traditional response would be swift removal and replacement, but something told the Pope that the easy path was not the right one. Thank you for your concern, Cardinal, Pope Leo said gently. But I believe we should continue the rehearsal. A murmur of surprise ran through the chapel. Cardinal Rossi's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared beneath his red cap. Continue? He repeated incredulously. But Your Holiness, this man has publicly spoken his truth, Pope Leo finished for him. With more passion than tact, perhaps, but with sincerity, the Pope turned back to Alessandro, who was watching this exchange with clear confusion. Maestro Bianchi, do you wish to continue working with us? Alessandro hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He glanced around at the Cardinal's disapproving faces, then back at Pope Leo's calm expression. Yes, he said finally, but I don't understand. I just insulted you in front of everyone. Pope Leo smiled slightly. Did you? I heard a man defending his life's passion. There are worse sins. The Cardinals exchanged troubled glances. One of them, a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned close to Pope Leo. Your Holiness, he whispered, though his voice carried in the perfect acoustics of the chapel. This sets a concerning precedent. If we allow such disrespect to go unchallenged, is forgiveness not at the heart of our faith, Cardinal Benelli? Pope Leo interrupted gently. Is humility not what we preach? The Cardinal stepped back, his lips pressed into a thin line. He clearly disagreed, but would not argue further with the Pope in public. Pope Leo turned his attention back to the choir and Roberto, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Shall we continue? The Pope suggested. I believe we were about to work on the full Lacrimosa section. Roberto nodded slowly, still looking stunned by this turn of events. Yes, Your Holiness. From the beginning of the movement, everyone. As Roberto raised his hands to conduct, Alessandro shot a questioning look at Pope Leo. The Pope nodded encouragingly, and the pianist turned back to the keys. The rehearsal resumed, but something had changed. The atmosphere remained charged, but the nature of that charge had shifted. The Cardinals withdrew to the sides of the chapel, their disapproval evident in their posture. The choir sang with technical precision but emotional caution, as if afraid to fully commit to the music after witnessing such an uncomfortable confrontation. Only Alessandro seemed transformed. He played with a new awareness, his technique still flawless but somehow more attuned to the choir's voices. He watched Roberto's conducting with actual attention now, adjusting his tempo and dynamics to better support the singers rather than dominate them. After they completed the Lacrimosa, Roberto called for a short break. The choir members dispersed, many of them gathering in small groups to whisper about what they had witnessed. The Cardinals conferred among themselves, occasionally glancing at Pope Leo with concerned expressions. Alessandro remained at the piano, shuffling through his sheet music with unusual care. Pope Leo approached him, moving unhurriedly up the center aisle. You played beautifully just now, the Pope said when he reached the piano. The way you supported the choir's final crescendo, it was perfect. Alessandro looked up, his face showing genuine surprise at the compliment. Thank you, Your Holiness, He hesitated, then continued with visible effort. I may have been too rigid in my interpretation earlier. Pope Leo nodded, acknowledging this small concession. Music, like faith, is a living thing. It breathes differently in different spaces, with different performers. The pianist studied Pope Leo's face, clearly trying to understand the older man's remarkable composure. Why aren't you angry? Alessandro finally asked, his voice low enough that only the Pope could hear. I disrespected you in front of everyone. The Cardinals clearly want me gone. Pope Leo smiled. Do you know why I love the Lacrimosa so much, Maestro Bianchi? Alessandro shook his head, puzzled by the seemingly unrelated question. The text speaks of tears of sorrow, yes, but also of transformation. Day of tears and mourning, when from the ashes shall arise a guilty man to be judged. It reminds us that we are all flawed, all in need of mercy. The Pope's eyes were kind but penetrating. Including me. Alessandro looked down at the keys. I still don't understand why you're allowing me to stay after what I said. Pope Leo was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. When I was much younger, he said finally, I studied at the conservatory in Milan before entering the seminary. This revelation clearly surprised Alessandro. You were a music student? The Pope nodded. For 3 years. I had a teacher, Professor Ricci, who was brilliant but terrifying. He accepted nothing less than perfection. A small smile touched Pope Leo's lips at the memory. During my final recital, I made a mistake in a Chopin nocturne. Just one wrong note, but in the silence afterward, Professor Ricci stood up and announced to the audience that I clearly had no feel for romantic composers and should stick to simpler pieces. Alessandro winced. That's harsh. It was humiliating, Pope Leo agreed. I was young and proud, and I never forgot the sting of those words. But do you know what I learned years later? Professor Ricci recommended me for a prestigious scholarship the very next day. When asked why after his public criticism, he said, because when he hit that wrong note, I watched his face. He wasn't embarrassed, he was heartbroken. That boy loves music in his soul. The Pope's eyes held Alessandro's. Sometimes our harshest critics see something in us that others miss. Your passion for music, your unwillingness to compromise your artistic vision, these are not flaws, Maestro Bianchi. They are gifts, even when expressed imperfectly. Alessandro seemed genuinely moved by the story. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently at a loss for words. Before the conversation could continue, Roberto called the choir back to order for the second half of the rehearsal. Pope Leo stepped back, gesturing for Alessandro to continue at the piano. As the rehearsal resumed, Pope Leo returned to his bench at the back of the chapel. Cardinal Rossi approached him, his face still troubled. Your Holiness, he said in a low voice. The other cardinals and I are concerned. This young man publicly challenged your authority. If word of this spreads, then people will hear that the Church is led by a man who values reconciliation over retribution, Pope Leo replied calmly. Is that so terrible, Cardinal? But the dignity of your office, no, is not so fragile that it cannot withstand a moment of honest criticism, the Pope finished for him. True dignity doesn't come from demanding respect, Cardinal. It comes from showing respect, even to those who may not seem to deserve it. Cardinal Rossi clearly wanted to argue further, but years of deference to papal authority held him back. He bowed slightly and returned to the other cardinals who listened to his whispered report with concerned expressions. The rehearsal continued, moving on to other pieces in the program. With each selection, something remarkable began to happen. Alessandro's playing, while still technically brilliant, took on a new quality, a sensitivity to the sacred character of the music that had been missing before. He still offered suggestions, still advocated for his artistic vision, but he did so with a newfound respect for the choir and for Roberto's direction. By the time they reached the final piece of the evening, Handel's Hallelujah chorus, the earlier tension had largely dissipated. The choir sang with renewed confidence, and Alessandro's accompaniment supported and elevated their voices rather than competing with them. As the triumphant final notes filled the chapel, Pope Leo closed his eyes, giving silent thanks for the transformation he was witnessing, not just in the music, but in the musician. When the rehearsal finally ended, the choir members gathered their things and began to file out, many of them stopping to bow to the Pope on their way. The cardinals departed as well, some still casting disapproving glances toward Alessandro. Roberto approached Pope Leo, looking both exhausted and relieved. Thank you, Your Holiness, for your wisdom this evening. I confess I was at a loss for how to handle the situation. Pope Leo smiled warmly. Sometimes the most difficult personalities create the most beautiful music, Director Roberto. We just need to find the right key. Roberto nodded, glancing back at Alessandro, who was slowly gathering his sheet music at the piano. Do you really think he can adapt his style for the concert? I think, Pope Leo said thoughtfully, that Maestro Bianchi may surprise us all. As Roberto left, Pope Leo remained in the chapel, watching as Alessandro finished packing his music into his leather portfolio. The pianist seemed deep in thought, his earlier arrogance replaced by what appeared to be genuine reflection. What would come next would test them both in ways neither could have anticipated. 2 weeks passed quickly after that eventful rehearsal in the Sistine Chapel. Each subsequent practice session showed small but significant changes in Alessandro's approach. The pianist still advocated for his artistic interpretations, but he did so with a new awareness of the sacred context of the music. The choir in turn became more willing to embrace some of his innovative ideas. It was an uneasy piece at first. The cardinals continued to watch Alessandro with suspicion, and some choir members remained wary of his intensity. But under Pope Leo's gentle guidance, A remarkable collaboration began to emerge. The morning of the charity concert arrived with perfect spring weather. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the Vatican as staff made final preparations. The concert would be held in the Paul VI Audience Hall, rather than the Sistine Chapel, allowing for a larger audience of nearly 6,000 people. Pope Leo rose early as usual, spending time in private prayer before the busy day ahead. As he finished his morning devotions, Sister Francesca knocked softly on the door of his private chapel. "Your Holiness," she said when he emerged, "Maestro Bianchi is asking to speak with you." He seems troubled. Pope Leo raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had interacted with Alessandro during the rehearsals, of course, but the pianist had never sought him out privately. "Please show him in," the Pope said, moving to his study to receive the visitor. A few minutes later, Alessandro entered looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His normally perfect hair was slightly mussed and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Your Holiness," he said, bowing awkwardly, "thank you for seeing me, especially after everything." Pope Leo gestured to a chair. "Please sit down. What troubles you on this important day?" Alessandro sat but immediately stood again, too agitated to remain still. "I couldn't sleep last night," he confessed. "I kept thinking about our first rehearsal, about what I said to you." He paced a few steps, then turned back to face the Pope. "I've never apologized properly. It's been 2 weeks and I still haven't said the words." Pope Leo watched him calmly. "You've shown your regret through your actions, Maestro Bianchi. Sometimes that speaks louder than words." "No," Alessandro insisted, "it's not enough. I disrespected you publicly in front of everyone. My behavior was," he struggled for the right word, "inexcusable." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Pope Leo. "I've been asking myself why you didn't dismiss me on the spot. Any other person in your position would have." "Perhaps," the Pope acknowledged with a small smile. "But then we might have missed the beautiful music we've created together these past 2 weeks." Alessandro shook his head in wonder. "That's exactly it. You saw past my arrogance to the music we could make. You saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself." He ran a hand through his hair, further disheveling it. "I've always defined myself by my talent, by being the best. It became a kind of armor. If I was brilliant enough, technical enough, no one could touch me." His voice grew quieter. "But you didn't attack my armor. You simply showed me it wasn't necessary." Pope Leo listened attentively, struck by the young man's sincerity. "I want you to know," Alessandro continued, "that I am truly sorry. Not just for my words that day, but for my attitude. You were right about sacred music. It isn't just about impressing an audience. It's about something larger than ourselves." The Pope stood and approached Alessandro, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for your apology. It is accepted fully and completely." His eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "Now perhaps you should get some rest before tonight's performance. You look like you've been up all night composing." Alessandro laughed, the tension finally leaving his face. "Almost. I was working on something, actually. A surprise for the concert." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you'll approve." "I look forward to it," Pope Leo said warmly. "Now go. The children's hospitals of Italy are counting on us to give them a memorable evening." By early evening, the Paul VI Audience Hall was filled to capacity. The audience was a mix of Vatican officials, wealthy donors, ordinary Romans who had purchased tickets, and a special section of children and families from the very hospitals that would benefit from the evening's proceeds. Backstage, the Sistine Chapel choir warmed up their voices while Roberto reviewed last-minute details with the stage managers. Alessandro sat at a small upright piano in a corner, playing quiet scales to loosen his fingers, his expression unusually serene. Pope Leo entered through a side door, dressed in his formal white cassock and red cape. The choir members and staff bowed or curtsied as he passed. When he reached Alessandro, the pianist stood and bowed deeply. "Your Holiness," Alessandro said, "about that surprise I mentioned this morning. I've added something to the program." With Director Roberto's permission, he added quickly, "It's after the Mozart Requiem section." Pope Leo nodded. "I trust your judgment, Maestro Bianchi." Those words, so simple, yet so profound given their history, brought a look of genuine gratitude to Alessandro's face. A few minutes later, the concert began. Pope Leo took his seat in the front row as Roberto led the choir onto the stage, followed by Alessandro in a perfectly tailored black suit. The audience applauded enthusiastically. From the first notes, it was clear that something special was happening. The weeks of rehearsal had melded Alessandro's technical brilliance with the choir's spiritual tradition, creating music that was both innovative and deeply reverent. The pianist's playing supported the voices without overwhelming them, and the traditional pieces gained new life through subtle, thoughtful reinterpretations. When they reached the Lacrimosa from Mozart's Requiem, the very piece that had sparked their initial conflict, Pope Leo felt a lump form in his throat. Alessandro's playing was transcendent, each note infused with emotion that seemed to touch everyone in the hall. The choir sang with perfect unity, their voices rising and falling like a single instrument guided by the pianist's sensitive accompaniment. As the final notes of the Requiem faded away, the audience remained silent for a moment before erupting into applause. Alessandro stood and bowed alongside Roberto in the choir, his face flushed with genuine emotion rather than his former pride. When the applause finally quieted, Alessandro returned to the piano alone. Roberto stepped forward to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a small addition to our program tonight," he announced. "Maestro Bianchi has prepared a special piece, dedicated to His Holiness Pope Leo XIV. A murmur of surprise ran through the audience. Pope Leo straightened in his seat, as curious as everyone else about what would follow. Alessandro settled at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The piece started simply, with a gentle melody that somehow evoked the quiet strength the Pope had shown throughout their time together. As it developed, hints of the sacred music they had rehearsed appeared, woven into an original composition that bridged the classical and the contemporary. It was, Pope Leo realized with growing wonder, a musical portrait of their journey together, from conflict to understanding, from arrogance to humility. The melody spoke of transformation, of seeing beyond differences to the common humanity beneath. As the piece reached its conclusion, Alessandro added a final, unexpected element. Without taking his hands from the piano, he began to sing in a clear tenor voice that no one, not even Roberto, had heard before. The Latin words of a traditional blessing filled the hall, carried on the wings of Alessandro's original melody. When the final notes faded into silence, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Even the cardinals, who had been so disapproving of Alessandro just 2 weeks earlier, were visibly moved. Pope Leo sat perfectly still, a single tear tracing its way down his weathered cheek. The silence lasted several heartbeats, then erupted into a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. Alessandro stood and bowed deeply, first to the audience, then specifically to Pope Leo. The Pope rose from his seat and approached the stage, climbing the short steps to stand beside the pianist. The applause continued as he embraced Alessandro warmly. "Thank you," Pope Leo said when he stepped back, his words meant for Alessandro alone despite the thousands watching. "You have given us all a great gift tonight." Alessandro shook his head slightly. "No, Your Holiness. You gave the greater gift when you responded to my disrespect with kindness. You could have dismissed me. Instead, you taught me that true greatness comes from humility." Pope Leo smiled and turned to address the audience, who quieted immediately. "Tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "we have witnessed the power of music to transform hearts and minds, but we have also witnessed something even more powerful, the ability to grow, to learn from our mistakes, to become better than we were." He gestured to Alessandro and the choir. "These talented musicians have raised funds for children in need, but they have also reminded us of a truth at the heart of our faith, that sometimes our greatest moments come not from asserting our authority, but from having the courage to set it aside." The choir members exchanged glances, many of them nodding in understanding. They had witnessed firsthand how the Pope's humble response to humiliation had led to tonight's triumph. As the concert concluded and the audience filed out, many commented on the extraordinary music they had heard. But what they remembered most, what became a story told and retold throughout Rome in the weeks that followed, was how a moment of public humiliation had been transformed by wisdom into one of the most profound displays of true leadership they had ever witnessed. And in the years to come, The unlikely friendship that developed between Pope Leo XIV and Alessandro Bianchi would produce many more moments of beauty, proving that the most powerful response to offense is not retaliation, but grace, a lesson that continues to stun and inspire all who hear their story.